And we welcome in Lyle Goldstein from the Marine Layer Podcast covering Mariners baseball. You want to know. And first of all, welcome, Lyle, and thanks for doing this for us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Cody, Luke, thanks for having me on. This is awesome.
Let's talk this because Cody and I were discussing, like, early in the offseason, Mariners-Cubs trade seemed like a real likely thing. They seemed like they were good partners. In your mind, what happened to that buzz? Where has it gone?
I'll kind of flip it back on your end. I feel like when Isaac Paredes was still a Cub, there was a little more wiggle room for a trade to potentially happen. But yeah, let me flip it back to you. Once Paredes got traded, you make the Kyle Tucker deal. Isn't there less room now for the Cubs to move an infielder? Because that's where the Mariners have needs. They have gaping holes right now at first, second, and third base. So there was a lot of Nico Hoerner discourse for a while, and I think for good reason. That's a guy I think Mariners people believe would fit in very, very well in Seattle for everything he does. But do the Cubs still have the leeway to deal an infielder at this point? Because that's what the Mariners are really looking for.
Well, I would say that, at least for Cubs fans, we feel like we have an surplus in infielders.
A plethora of infielders. Some aren't any good, but we've got infielders.
Yeah, well, when you say some aren't very good, they're bench players probably, but also names like James Triantos, a top 100 prospect in baseball. I don't think Matt Shaw was ever a serious consideration for the Cubs to move, but Triantos for sure, and he projects a lot like Nico Hoerner too, and he's on the verge of making his major league debut perhaps in 2025. I do think that, and I also, because of that, I have wondered how the Cubs feel about Nico Hoerner as well, just because Triantos could replace him. Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of been a big part of the Cubs fan discourse related to this type of conversation, if that helps you.
Yeah, I mean, Lyle, in my opinion, I would say it's still a possibility because Matt Shaw, who right now tentatively is their third baseman as a rookie, and their top prospect, really is better probably at playing second base. So there is still potential that you could move Nico Hoerner and Matt Shaw could become your second baseman. That would involve the Cubs trying to find somebody to play third base. Bregman, which seems like a long shot, but that would be the path to something like that happening. I think the talks kind of died down or slowed down. I think everybody's waiting on Roki. I think the Cubs are waiting to see if they're getting a starting pitcher at a cheap price before they go out and trade away some of their prospects and maybe a Nico Hoerner or whoever that might be. So I think it's a waiting game on the Roki decision.
I think that's what Mariners people feel like too. And I don't think the Mariners are going to end up landing Roki Sasaki, but I feel like the Mariners, among a lot of teams, are waiting that out right now for a couple different reasons. Number one, to see where he lands. And number two, if it's not Seattle, if it's not, or if it is Chicago, where could the Mariners then look to make a trade? Because that's the route they're going to go at this point. It's not coming from free agency. Their ownership won't give them any money at all to spend. So if anything happens, it's going to be through the trade route. And I think once Roki Sasaki signs somewhere, they're going to look to some of those teams that did not land him, that are still looking for potential starting pitching, and could go that route. And I will say, I don't think the Mariners are exactly itching to deal Luis Castillo. There's been plenty of rumors about it this offseason, and there's been plenty of reports that they've been in talks about Castillo and other players, and that's real. But I think the Mariners are more in a mode of they would have to be blown away by a package to move them. Otherwise, they may just stand pat. So if that's the Cubs, maybe they put a package together they can't refuse. But I'm with you guys in a long-winded answer. I think Roki Sasaki and that domino falling on January 15th or maybe a couple days after will kickstart some of those discussions again.
That's interesting that you say that, because it just kind of reminds me of how the Cubs are operating and the fact that the Mariners clearly need to add bats. Like the pitching you guys have, I dream about the Cubs having this kind of pitching. And in many ways, it's a really good situation that you have, but if you're going to take that next step, if you're going to put yourself into real contention, if you're going to go win the AL West, which is tough, with the Rangers and the improvements they've made this offseason. Even the Athletics have made some improvements this offseason. And the Astros are the Astros. If you're going to make that next step and either win your division or at least be in that wild card, I feel like after last year watching them, you would feel like you need to add bats. And as you just said, their ownership group isn't providing the money, so the trade market is where they're headed. So I feel like it's also like a stalemate between both teams if we're talking about the Cubs and the Mariners, because from the Cubs' perspective, they have a lot of nice players. Their pitching staff is fine, but in my opinion, they could use a higher-end starter, whether that's Luis Castillo or I could dream a little bit about Brian Wu or whoever that you guys have. But I don't think the Cubs want to give Owen Casey and, like 2 top 100 guys. I think if it came down to it and they got tired of staring at each other, I guess, and realized that this is what we need to do, maybe they would. But I don't. My experience during the Jed Hoyer era for the Cubs is he never acts on desperation, and so I'm curious to where is this something that could potentially be brought back up before the trade deadline with the Mariners or the Cubs? Maybe both are in a situation where things played out exactly how we feel, where the Mariners, for example, the pitching's awesome, you're in there, but you need a bat. And in the Cubs' perspective, the pitching has been fine, but man, they're right there. They could put themselves into a higher ceiling potential if they add that big starting pitcher. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like both teams are so similar, and I'm curious to where or how this could go. I'm saying a lot here, and I'm sorry, but there's just so much here. Like, it just makes so much sense for me in my head that something would happen, whether it's Luis Castillo or one of your young pitchers. The Mariners clearly need bats. The Cubs clearly need a pitcher with a higher ceiling. And I'm just like, when are these two organizations who have been mid for the last couple years going to just put their meat on the table and get something done, man?
People have been asking about the Mariners and a lot of teams. The team the Mariners seem to get linked with the most in trade talks, or the team that people seem to think is the best match made in heaven, is Baltimore, because Baltimore's in a position where they've got all the young bats in the world. They don't have pitching. The Mariners have all these young arms and this amazing rotation, and they need bats. But it's not just Baltimore, right? Like, they've talked to Boston, they've talked to the Cubs, they've talked to a flurry of teams at this point. I would say, in terms of what the Mariners might consider giving up, I think the only guy that's even quote unquote on the table, at least right now, is Castillo. And I think partly that's because how much they love their other 4 arms. And I think partly, yeah. And partly that's just because they're also really inexpensive right now. Castillo is the one guy making real money. And when you have a $15 million self-imposed budget like the Mariners put on themselves, I don't know if that's made it out to Cubs land or not, but that's a real number, by the way. Mariners ownership basically came out and said, we have $15 million to spend this offseason. And you've got people sitting around saying, how in the world are you supposed to make this team better with $15 million? Yeah. So that's why these Luis Castillo rumors and trade talks have come into place, because they say, well, if you clear some money, maybe that frees you up to add some more bats. I still say that with the idea and belief of, if the Mariners were to trade Castillo, that they would not do it unless they got a real package back. And whether that's right or not, I think that's where the team stands and what they believe in the sense of, you guys might totally throw your arms up at this, and I might even too, but if I were the Mariners, I would guess they're looking for something like a controllable bat and a controllable arm back for Castillo, in the sense of,
wow.
If we've talked about Kobe Mayo a lot for Castillo, just in terms of that is a third baseman right on the brink of the majors. He's had a cup of coffee in the big leagues, has 40 home run potential. So who would that guy be with the Cubs? I mean, they could go the Nico Hoerner route, although he's got less club control. But if I'm the Mariners, I bet you they're looking for something back like Matt Shaw and Javier Assad, which if you're the Cubs and Jed Hoyer, you probably say no to that, right?
Yeah.
I
would think so.
Yeah. I mean, me personally, like, if I'm giving up Matt Shaw or Owen Casey, who I think those are the 2 best bats prospect-wise that they have, if I'm giving up 2 of those guys, or one of those guys, like I wouldn't be talking about Luis Castillo. I'd be talking about Bryce Miller or Logan Gilbert. And like this is just the state of doing business in baseball right now. Like so many teams, and like the Mariners is such a great example. You're talking about ownership only wanting to spend $15 million or giving that the budget of $15 million. No wonder they don't want to trade those guys because they're so cheap. And eventually they're going to have to pay them, and they probably won't, right? Like, this is the problem with baseball. This has turned into just us talking about the problem in baseball.
Well, fan bases aren't going to be happy with the trade. I'm curious from your perspective. It doesn't have to be a player. Like you gave us a hypothetical of players going both ways. What's Castillo worth? What type of pitcher is he, and has he been in your eyes? Like, why should the Cubs be interested in upping their ante if that's where it's at right now?
Well, you can look at it a couple of different ways. I mean, just a season ago in 23, Luis Castillo finished 5th in Cy Young voting. This guy has been an ace, and that's who the Mariners traded for him to be. And both in the back half of 22 when they got him and in 2023, he was exactly that. Now, in 2024, he was still good. He was still a really reliable arm that went 6-2 almost every time out and kept his team in the game. But there's a reason he's out on the table now, and it's not just for the sake of his money. I'm sure that's part of it, but didn't have the same command that he's had in some years past. Slider wasn't quite as good, got into some bad counts. Fastball isn't, it's funny, he's evolved a lot as a pitcher over the years, because when he was with the Reds, he had one of the most dominant changeups in baseball. That was his bread and butter. That was his go-to pitch. That was his out pitch. Once he got to the Mariners, and even that first half of 22 with the Reds, he kind of got away from the changeup. It started to lose some of its value, and he became very fastball heavy and fastball effective. And now, look, he still has an abundance of weapons in his arsenal, but his fastball, which has been his best pitch over the last couple of years, it didn't have the same effect that it had in 22 and 23. So I guess this is a long-winded way of me saying, well, he's still been good, and he's still been a very valuable arm, and I think the Mariners would love to keep him in the rotation if they can, but he's probably the weak link of the 5 at this point because he's getting older, and in 24, you saw a slight decrease in production. Now, that's not to say he couldn't bounce back in 25, and it was just kind of a one-off. But I think if you're some teams out there that might be looking at the idea of trading for him, like the Cubs, you might see some of that. And you might also see the idea of, well, he pitches in the most pitcher-friendly park in baseball. How would he do outside of Seattle? So who are you getting in Luis Castillo? If you get him, you're getting a great pitcher. You're getting a guy that is still a 2-starter, maybe 3-starter at his worst. But yeah, he's not the Logan Gilbert of this rotation. He's not the George Kirby of this rotation. And I think that's why he's on the trade block. I mean, I don't know if he's on the trade block, but that's why his name has been floated around plenty this offseason in trade talks.
It's like Nico Hoerner. The Cubs love Nico Hoerner, but he doesn't have a ton of power at second base. He's good defensively. He does all the things you like, but is there a way to possibly upgrade there? Maybe.
Would you rather have the years of control and upside of Kobe Mayo or Nico Hoerner? And you don't even have to answer that. Like, that's pretty obvious. You know what
sure.
I mean?
Yeah. And especially if you're the Mariners, where Hoerner, if I have this right, slated to make what, $12 million this year? Where
around that,
Mayo's going to make league minimum for the next 3 until he hits arbitration. So yeah, especially if you're the Mariners. Let me flip it back to you guys, because this is talking from our end and what we feel like the Mariners would be looking for, because they certainly have not set that price anywhere low on Luis Castillo, and I think that's part of the reason the trade hasn't happened yet. But you guys are on the other side of this. If you were willing to make a trade for Luis Castillo, what would you guys be willing to give up?
Me personally, like, it starts with James Triantos. I'm willing to move on from James Triantos because I think he projects a lot like Nico Hoerner. Nico Hoerner has 2 more years of control, and clearly the Cubs love him. And he's a proven major league commodity. But I also
is top 100, and he's sort of blocked.
Right, yeah. And that's kind of the thing, too. But I don't know how many more at-bats that he needs in the minors. Like, he got to AAA last year. He started the year in AA, got to AAA. But I certainly think there's a lot of value in a player like him right now. And I think that for what the Mariners need, he is a guy that could certainly be on their roster, if not on opening day, but, you know, by midseason at least. And obviously there's a lot of, you don't know what's going to happen, but he will make the league minimum. And so it makes sense for them.
I just don't know who the pitcher, like if you're saying some sort of controllable pitcher back, that's the tricky part, because I don't think the Cubs are in a position to deal arms right now. Like they're just not. In my eyes, they still have to add multiple arms. And so if that's something they're looking for, that gets trickier unless they're willing to just take prospects. And I don't think the Mariners just want prospects. Like they're trying to be considered as a serious team, just like the Cubs are now. And both teams are just really sort of walking a fine line of being okay.
I personally, not to cut you off, I personally think that I personally wouldn't give away Hoerner for someone like Castillo based off everything you just said about Castillo. Like, I think the things that I feel confident about Castillo and why I'm intrigued about the Cubs potentially adding him, he's always healthy. He eats innings for you. Those are the two things. And you don't see a lot of that in baseball these days. Those are the two things. But his baseball savant, it's out there for the public to see, right? Like, there's reasons for concern, and you explain them, right? So I'm more willing to give up one of the Cubs prospects who basically has been blocked because of Nico Hoerner. And if I have to throw in, I personally would be willing to move a Jordan Wicks or a Javier Assad as part of that. I think Cubs fans might think I'm being a little too heavy, but at the same time, there's the money that Castillo is owed. I honestly don't know if the Cubs would be willing to take that on either. So I think that it's so much more complex, and that's why this hasn't happened. But I think as far as players, Triantos, Jordan Wicks, or Javier Assad, I think that's a conversation starter at least.
Cheap trading with cheap is tough. It's tough to find that.
At least for you guys, what would you consider yourselves mid-market? We call ourselves big market, but we don't act like it.
Yeah, I'd call the Mariners mid-market, and they often don't act like a mid-market. That's what I'd say. Yeah. In the sense of it's below that a lot of the time. Yeah, here's where you run into a problem, right? Well, so first off, to your point about the money, I think that's a very real point. And I don't know if the Mariners are operating like that's even a factor when it should be. I think they may be looking at Castillo's contract and saying, look at what pitchers are getting on the market right now. Like Castillo's contract is super valuable because all these guys are getting crazy money. Look at what even somebody like Luis Severino and Nathan Eovaldi got in free agency. That's essentially what Luis is making, where if you're on the other side of it, just because the Mariners think the contract shouldn't be a barrier because he's on somewhat of a friendly deal, that doesn't mean that other teams that are looking at him are saying the same thing. They're still looking at it like the Cubs may be and saying, we still have to take on $24 million a year. That's not nothing. So you run into that problem of it. And then you run into the problem of, since these two teams are in similar boats, the Mariners don't want to give up that much off their big league roster because they want to be competitive in 2025. But every team they're going to talk with in trades, like the Cubs, don't want to give up that much off their big league roster either of impact because they're trying to compete in 2025. And this is where the stalemate comes to head again, because neither side wants to balk and feel like they're really subtracting off their big league roster. And this is probably another reason why either the Castillo trade is taking a long time or it just wouldn't happen with any team.
All right, we'll just keep on waiting. This has been fun trying to figure it out either way. Lyle Goldstein from the Marine Layer Podcast, part of the Just Baseball Media Network. Hey, Lyle, let's do this again during the season when we recreate this trade scenario right before the trade deadline. Does that sound fair?
That sounds great. Luke, Cody, thanks so much for having me. This has been a blast, and happy to hop on anytime.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Have a great season, hopefully for you.
You guys too.
We all silly like the mayor.